Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. September 4th, 2025, the CDC DOA edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast here in Washington, D.C., where we've had just a magnificent kind of stretch of weather, but maybe all of the Northeast has. We'll check with Emily Bazelon in New Haven.
Yes. Beautiful.
And I'm suspecting if it's been that way in New Haven and that way in D.C., it surely has been that way in New York City, where John Dickerson is. Hello, John.
We make our own weather.
Okay. Is that the kind of thing you say from the anchor's chair every night here on CBS?
I'm just going to say random stuff from now on.
Zen
More
koans.
so than usual.
As if it's a new thing.
This week on the Gabfest, what does the spate of Trump legal defeats this week mean? Will the Supreme Court reverse them? Are they important, either from a legal perspective, a policy perspective, or a political perspective? Then the gutting of the CDC, the wholesale abandonment of vaccines and other public health measures. Why bother monitoring foodborne illness anyway? We're going to talk to public health expert Josh Sharfstein about the triumph of the quacks. Then Congress is back, and the major question facing Democrats is, should they compel a government shutdown or avoid it? We're going to talk about the big game theory question here in Washington. Plus, we'll have cocktail chatter.
The spirit of innovation is deeply ingrained in America, and Google is helping Americans innovate in ways both big and small. From improving emergency response times to protecting against cyber attacks, local, state, and federal governments are innovating with Google AI. This is a new era of American innovation. Find out more at g.co/American innovation.
Let's play Burlington's Guess That Price. Back to school means back to saving. We're bringing you kids' jeans starting at, hold on a minute, just $11.99. Burlington's acing this test. What about character backpacks? We've got them starting at $12.99. Burlington's done it again. How about sneakers for the kids? A-plus brands and right on trend starting at $11.99. Saving is now in session. Burlington, deals, brands, wow! Styles and selections vary by location.
Emily, you already have your face in your hands. That seems too soon.
That was
just too soon.
That was just extraordinary. We went immediately into a pose of abject.
I swear.
Okay.
Oh,
I thought it was the despair.
No, it wasn't.
Oh
it was
God.
like independent of my emotions.
Okay.
Honestly.
It was,
All right,
yes.
good.
Next, the rending of shirts.
So many rulings in a wide
this is
swathe of Trump-related litigation this week. John is having a separate conversation. The conservative.
No, this is all week. I was thinking, I wonder what Emily thinks.
Here we're about to find out.
Yeah.
There's this wide swathe. We have the conservative Fifth Circuit saying the administration could not use the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelans. A district court judge in California saying the president did not have the power to put federal troops in LA to police the city. A federal judge in DC stopping the government from deporting plane loads of Guatemalan children under the cover of night. A district court judge holding that the Trump administration couldn't withhold funds from Harvard as it did, and a federal appeals court ruling that many of Trump's tariffs were illegal, all in one week. There were a couple of other decisions that went more in the administration's favor. So the unifying theme of these cases, Emily, generally, is that the predicate for Trump's action is that some form of emergency that he has declared was pretextual, exaggerated, not credible, does not justify the extensive action that he took. Will the Supreme Court agree? Is that how it's going to end?
Wait, are you jumping all the way to the end?
Okay. I'm just trying to keep things moving, but Emily can. You guys never answer questions I ask anyway, so what does it matter?
True. I was going to say that is a great question, and what's happening right now is that the Trump administration is trying to turn emergency powers into basically like permanent sweeping presidential authority to do lots of things that presidents haven't done in the past, right? I mean, there's the troops in the streets, there's the tariffs, there's trying to destroy Harvard. There's just a lot of, and then these particular kinds of deportations. There's just lots of examples. And the district courts are saying, halt in several of these circumstances because they're looking at the statutes. They don't think the statutes exactly authorize what the president is doing. And they're willing to question whether the president has the authority to say something in his emergency when, it's obviously not an emergency. And I think that's the fundamental question for the very conservative Supreme Court is, are they going to look beneath the hood of the car? Because so much of what the administration is doing, there's a thinly veiled pretext for it, right? Thus far, when you look at the Supreme Court's responses to the Trump administration, especially on the emergency docket, which has swelled to much higher volume already in the Trump administration than we've seen in the past, the court has not been interested in going down this road of evaluating whether there is a pretext here. And you kind of have to call the administration on its bullshit in order to say that these things are not emergencies. Now, there are Supreme Court precedents in which the court in the past has been willing to say that about the presidency. In the first Trump administration, the best example of this was the idea of changing the census in a way that seemed like an obvious pretext. And the majority opinion by Chief Justice John Roberts was willing to call it the administration. So, and also, these statutes are different. Some of them, the questioning of emergency power is probably more plausible than in others based on the actual text of the statute. And I think that's really important, both for the eventual rulings and for the larger questions about the rule of law. But I'm glad we started here because that is the fundamental question, I think.
I'm actually not glad we started here because isn't it the case that that what's at issue is not just whether it's an emergency or not. Isn't also what's at issue is even if it is an emergency, he ain't the one who's supposed to address the emergency. So maybe if we talked about one of these individual rulings,
let's
isn't
talk
that
about
also
tariffs, right? Because I think tariffs is a great example of that. Yeah. So you're totally right, John. That is what the federal appeals court that ruled 7-4 against the administration this week. That is exactly what they said. They said, okay, let's look at the fact that the Constitution gives the power to impose tariffs and taxes to Congress, not to the president. This is really a fundamental aspect of American separation of powers, and we should not be messing around with it. And then they looked at the text of this emergency statute, which is called, the acronym is IEPA, that the Trump administration invoked. And IEPA, the text of it does have the words regulate and importation of property from foreign countries in it. And that's the authority that Trump is invoking for these, huge tariffs that are all over the world. But the word tariff isn't in there. And so then if you go to this important, if recent Supreme Court doctrine that's supposed to govern how statutes are interpreted, the major questions doctrine, the whole idea here during the Biden administration was, wait a minute, president, executive branch, you can't take a broadly worded statute and apply it in a context in which none of the words of the statute seem to apply. Because if you're doing some giant thing, some major thing with lots of economic and social implications, Congress has to expressly authorize what the agency is doing. And so now the question is whether that is going to also apply to the Trump administration. And to presidents as opposed to agency action. And we just don't know the answer yet. But you can see why the federal appeals court would be concerned about this.
John, I know you're about to say.
It's okay, but you haven't been allowed to, so I'll shut up. Go ahead.
Well, no, you haven't been allowed to
okay.
do. But I do think, I think this question about the major questions doctrine is so interesting because in a way, it's like where you see the locus of action taking place. When the Supreme Court looked at the executive actions by the Biden administration, it found that these agencies, these unelected bureaucrats, were interpreting law and making major decisions that belong to Congress. But now when you see this in a conservative president, a conservative administration, the conservative court looks like conservatives look at this and see, oh no, there's a unitary, it is the executive. The executive is taking the action. The executive is making critical decisions to protect the nation in an urgent moment. They saw the action as they depict the action as bureaucrats when it's during the Biden administration, and the all-powerful unitary executive when it's during the Trump administration. And depending on where you like if you believe in the unitary executive theory, you're like, oh, well, of course the unitary executive has to have this autonomy to make these decisions in the moment.
And that's the way in which these two questions are both interlinked, because all you have to do to say, of course, the unitary executive must handle this case, is to say this case is an emergency, and the executive was set up to work with dispatch and secrecy. So it must be for the executive, even if the definition of it as an emergency isn't true. What I thought was interesting about the use of the major questions doctrine was that then in his response to this ruling, the president said, if you do this, you'll ruin the economy, which brought two things to mind for me. First of all, thereby affirming that this is, in fact, a major question. This isn't some small thing. So, in fact, okay, now that doesn't close the road down that David just articulated, but it does certainly take care of the idea about whether what he was doing here was a major change. But the second thing is that the court is not, it reminded me of that old expression from the 70s, which is your lack of planning is not my emergency, which is to say that the court can't not do something, the something being enforce the separation of powers enshrined in the Constitution. It can't not do something because a president says, well, if you do that, it's going to create an emergency. Because then you create this emergencies built on top of emergencies. I declare an emergency, I do something, and then you can't stop me from doing it, because to stop me from doing it would create another emergency, which is exactly what the founders worried about, which is that you give emergency powers to a chief executive and they will just come up with new emergencies. They were worried, of course, in the first case that anybody can claim something's an emergency. But then there's the second thing, which is that emergencies beget emergencies. And then finally, just going back to the Constitution, which is why it's so important about who has the power to do this, is the whole reason they designed it is so that when people and companies are taxed, which is what happens with a tariff, that the people closest, the representatives closest to those people and companies are the ones who make the decisions, not some single dude. So far, it's only been dudes. So that was like a design intent of the document. And secondly, Madison, in arguing for why you needed to give the power of taxation to Congress, was as a break on an executive authority. Like specifically when talking about the abstract idea of making executives too powerful, he said, no, we're going to give the taxation power and the spending power to Congress, which will limit the power of the presidency. So in both specific terms and global terms, this is an attack on the design of the American system.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's sort of the threat of blowing two holes in everything that the founders were setting up, right? There's blowing the emergency hole where suddenly like emergencies swamp the normal course of duty, and Trump can call troops on the street indefinitely, or he can impose tariffs indefinitely, because once you say it's an emergency, it just kind of goes on forever. And, obviously this is a trick that authoritarian rulers like pull out of their back pocket. He's not the first one to come up with it. I think part of what is, one reason the district courts have been so skeptical is that where is the emergency? Like, we're talking about just normal, trade relationships with other countries, or we're talking about like Los Angeles having a relatively like standard amount of protest about ICE raids. There wasn't some huge change or blip. And so that makes it, I think, harder for at least the district courts to swallow. And then the second issue is this question of, if a statute like IEEPA grants some emergency powers to the president, but doesn't lay out a tariff emergency power, like why read it in? Especially because part of what Congress was doing in IEEPA was responding to President Nixon imposing tariffs based on a broader statute. And so there's this brief by a bunch of legal scholars, both conservatives and liberals, pointing at that legislative history and saying, wait a second, like it's very clear that Congress had something else in mind here. There's a reason why they didn't put tariffs into this emergency power statute. And we'll just have to see where the Supreme Court lands with this.
John, historically, what has been so there have been presidents who've had more authoritarian tendencies or have wanted to accrete more executive power. And generally, there's been a fairly strong resistance up until now. Like we haven't moved towards an authoritarian presidential dictatorship in this country in the way that some other countries with similar political systems have. Has the basic holdback mechanism been the men who've occupied the presidential office have been bound by some sense of restraint or some sense of order? Has it been that there's been Congress that has been actively protecting its borders and protecting its prerogatives? Has it been the public outrage? Has it been that the Supreme Court has blocked the president? I mean, like, what is it that has kept us from this until now? Because right now it seems like none of the things that could prevent Trump from doing this are in place.
Yay! This is my favorite question. I mean, there's a reason that when I was trying to figure out the presidency, that I started with the revolt against FDR's request to expand the presidency, which was so modest by today's standards. He essentially wanted a few more aides in the executive branch, and Congress went nuts, and people took trains to Washington to picket in the streets, claiming that this was an executive overreach. So we also know about FDR and the role that the Supreme Court played in trying to constrain him. So it's all the things you mentioned, David. One of my favorite ideas is the notion of constitutional restraint in the executive, so that the battle between the branches is not just ambition versus ambition, that there needs to be a kind of constitutional temperament in all of the branches, that they don't press everything to the maximalist and just let the other two branches try to stop them, that they have some understanding. And this would imply in the tariff case, when you do something that is constitutionally dubious, you don't put all your chips on that play. Because if it has to be reversed in keeping with the foundations of the government, the consequences are going to be huge. So you have to keep in mind the consequences of what you're doing. You don't just get to do whatever you want and make the other two stop you. So that is a sense of restraint housed in the presidency. Then, of course, there's the public. Before we were so partisanly messed up, public opinion played a stronger role. We talked about it last week. That's a problem. Obviously, the Congress, which has at various times, I mean, think of like the War Powers Resolution, the reforms after Watergate, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, as weak as it may have been, was an attempt to limit the president's ability. We'll talk about the Impoundment Act in the next section. Emily was talking about the law that President Trump is trying to use with tariffs, which is an attempt to constrain Nixon. So you've had Congress, when it was operating functionally, did a lot of this work. It would slap down presidents if they even thought about trying to stray onto Congress's turf. And then, of course, you have the courts. So you have the court packing plan. I was reading again about Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, which is where Truman seized the steel mills. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Congress hasn't authorized it. So you get all of those places is where it has happened in the past. And it's not happening in restraint from the presidency. It's not happening with Congress. The public voice is reshaped by all the things we talk about every week. And then it now goes to the Supreme Court, which has, found new powers in the presidency by a lot of people's estimation. And we'll see how they keep ruling on these things.
Emily, just to bring us home, there was a Noah Feldman article in Bloomberg, a little bit wish casting, it felt like to me, saying the Supreme Court has actually been behaving correctly here. It has weak powers. It's trying to protect the weak powers that it has and not provoke a conflict that it would lose, and mostly protect the rule of law. Is that what you see when you look at this court? And what do you see the court doing when these cases get? Or you don't have to prognosticate that, but if you want to.
I mean, just to make Noah's argument at a little greater length, I think what he is saying is that you don't have to agree with all the decisions to think that it's important for the Supreme Court not to pick every fight with President Trump. That, always you have to remember that judges don't have their own police force, and they have this kind of tricky balancing relationship, especially with the president, who does have an army and lots of federal agents to order all over the country. And that the court, it's incumbent on the court to try to navigate around a direct constitutional crisis, and that there are all these important disputes that are coming up. And so the court basically has to keep its powder dry for the most important ones. That's the argument. I think what is difficult for me to square here is that the court has been really I think, aggravating the situation by giving Trump more power and seeming to exceed and kind of inviting the Trump administration to demand more and more. And this goes back to the immunity decision from a year ago before Trump was elected. Like, that's been incredibly important. And the administration has been invoking that in cases that are not about criminal immunity for the president, but clearly sees it as license. So let's start with that. But there are more of these kind of what I would say are like kind of own goals that the Supreme Court has been scoring for the presidency. They just seem really interested in this idea of the unitary executive and more power and not looking underneath the hood of the car. And so I don't see in the record so far the kinds of real stoplights that would, suggest to the Trump administration that they're going down the wrong road. I mean, one example of this is the setup, for Trump's move to fire Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve Board. I think the Supreme Court was trying to say, don't mess with the Fed board when they granted the president authority to fire the heads of all these other independent agencies in this decision, Trump versus Wilcox in May. This is the one with like the special little sentence in here about how the Fed is different. But the court didn't make it clear. And they didn't say, and if you say that you're firing someone for cause, like you better really have cause, right? They kind of baited or at least opened the door to the president saying, well, I do have cause to make this firing, and so this is still okay. So that's why I feel like there is a kind of wish casting in Noah's argument here. It just isn't really reflected in the specifics of the record of how the court has been responding. I think it would be true about the lower courts, but not about the Supreme Court.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Upwork. Hiring shouldn't be a hassle or a drain on your budget. Upwork is your one-stop shop to find, hire, and pay top freelance talent, saving you time and keeping costs in check. Companies at every stage turn to Upwork to get things done and find flexibility in the way they staff key projects and initiatives. And Upwork's global marketplace is filled with top talent in IT, web dev, AI, design, admin support, marketing, and more. Plus, posting a job on Upwork is easy with no cost to join. You can register, browse freelancer profiles, get help drafting a job post, or even book a consultation. From there, you can connect with freelancers and easily hire them. Upwork makes the entire process simpler and more affordable with industry-low fees. So post a job today and hire tomorrow with Upwork. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's Upwork.com to post your job for free and connect with top talent ready to help your business grow. That's UPWORK.com, Upwork.com. This episode of the Gabfest is brought to you by BetterHelp. We turn to some funny places for support. A barista, a hairdresser, a random stranger in the bathroom for life advice. But not everyone is a therapist. And as fun as they are to talk to about everyday topics, when you're looking for help about relationships, anxiety, depression, or other clinical issues, it's better to get guidance from a credentialed therapist online with BetterHelp. With over 30,000 therapists, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served over 5 million people globally. A short questionnaire helps identify your needs and preferences, and BetterHelp's 10 plus years of industry-leading match fulfillment rate means they typically find the right therapist for you the first time. Plus, you can pause your subscription whenever you need to and switch therapists anytime at no extra cost. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Find the one with BetterHelp. Gabfest listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/Gabfest. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Gabfest. It's been a great week for the charlatans and the quacks, the patent medicine makers and the supplementers, the lovers of ivermectin and copper and unpasteurized milk. The dismantling of the American public health infrastructure accelerated. It was already going pretty quickly, accelerated with the firing of the newly confirmed director of the CDC and the departure of many of the top public health officials at the CDC, historically one of the world's gold star public health organizations. The CDC purge seems to have stemmed from widespread dismay about HHS Secretary Kennedy's many efforts to weaken access to vaccines. We will get into the many things he's doing, dismantling vaccine committee, removing funding for global vaccines, removing funding for vaccine research, and not supporting the vaccines that exist, discouraging people from getting measles vaccines. That's just one piece of the kind of broad decay of America's public health infrastructure, or remaking of America's public health infrastructure under Kennedy and Trump. Also, by the way, Florida this week decided that school children no longer had to be vaccinated. They ended vaccine mandates. So get ready for a lot of measles and chickenpox and diphtheria and polio and rubella and diseases you didn't even remember. So to talk about this, we are joined by one of America's true public health experts, Dr. Josh Sharfstein. He's a public health professor at Johns Hopkins, also the former health commissioner of Baltimore, the former health secretary of Maryland, former principal deputy commissioner of the FDA, and just also a great podcaster on public health. So Josh, what real world effects can we start to expect to see from the overturning of the federal public health infrastructure, from the personnel changes to the unfunding of various things to changes in public health recommendations? What will actually happen? When can we expect to see things happening?
Sure. Well, there's some things that are in the short term. Those tend to be access to good information, and access to vaccines will probably be the first things. But then over time, they're going to be increasing impacts on health itself. So we've already seen that with so many people leaving the CDC, that when the phone rings, people are not answering. When I was the health commissioner of Baltimore, we had a arsenic in the park situation that we had no idea what to do with. And it was like 9 o'clock at night, and somebody was on call at CDC and really helped us out, able to answer so many questions before people in the city had them. Recently, the Milwaukee health commissioner had an issue with lead in water and couldn't get anyone on the line at CDC. I've heard that's the first time that happened in a very, very long time. So that's happening now all around the country on different issues, including the measles response. Some local health officials weren't able to get good and timely input, I understand. So that has local implications. And then nationally, we're looking at these vaccine recommendations that are trickling out. And we already see that some pharmacies are not able to make vaccines as available as they have been in the past in certain states based on state laws. And all that's foreseeable. I think kids are going to have a much harder time getting the COVID vaccine this fall, particularly kids in that 6 month to 2 year range recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics for that first dose of the COVID vaccines, because right before the vaccine season started, they pulled the Pfizer vaccine off the market, and it's just gotten a lot more complicated. So, that's the early impact. I think over time, it's all about health. CDC does so many things that we don't recognize that have big impacts for people's health. And we're going to see that in chronic disease rates, lead poisoning, water quality, all kinds of different issues that CDC is involved in, and of course, infectious disease because of vaccines. And you did allude to the international vaccine issues that have happened. And, when vaccines are not available internationally, there are just enormous consequences for health. And it's been estimated that hundreds of thousands of kids will die from that over time.
We've been so reliant on the CDC and the national government. Are there other players that could take up some of the slack here, like the recommendations that you mentioned from the American Academy of Pediatrics or the American Medical Association? Should parents be now turning to those professional medical associations for advice? Can the states and cities step in? Should we wish for these kinds of solutions, or should we be trying to push for the federal government to put itself back together?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emily. I mean, there are some very important efforts right now to replace what the CDC used to be, which was an organization that could be counted on to give really the best recommendations using the best science. Recently, I believe Washington, Oregon, and California announced that they'd be making recommendations on vaccines. There were reports about a New England consortium of health commissioners that will be working together. Definitely, you have the professional medical associations, which really have an important role here because people trust their healthcare provider. And there's a program called the Vaccine Integrity Project that's brought a lot of experts together. So there will be things outside of government that will be right. They will give good information. The challenge is that the federal government is pretty important, both in terms of resources and in terms of legal authority. If the federal government makes something unavailable, it doesn't matter how many people are recommending that you take it. And also because of its influence and the way people think about it. And I just want to introduce a concept here, which is borrowed credibility, right? Right now they have borrowed credibility. Like what I mean is that people trusted the CDC. And now when the CDC says something that's wrong, people kind of like, oh, wait a second, the CDC saying that? Think about it like if you had like Surgeon General's warning, everyone needs to wear underwear on their head. Then you'd be like, well, if the Surgeon General's saying that, right? It's not just like some random person saying that. It's sort of borrowing the credibility of the Surgeon General to say something that doesn't make any sense. But that's what's happening. And that turns out to be very, very confusing for people.
Josh, give me your sense of, it feels like everything's going to get highly regional now. So let's imagine you live in Oregon, Washington, and California, which both has its own recommendations about public health and then also encourages you as a resident to look to those associations. So in this new regime, we're talking about where basically certain states and kinds of people build a workaround of a no longer functioning federal health system. Does that then mean if you live in a state where none of those things are going on, you suffer an extra disadvantage? And then okay, you make that choice, you live in that state, maybe that's fine. But then how much do the borders of the state actually matter? Obviously, they didn't in COVID. So If you're not taking the COVID vaccine in Florida and you fly to Washington State, you're out of luck if you live in Washington State. Well, so how much do you think it becomes highly regionalized?
Well, you're absolutely right, John. In public health, sometimes we call this the pee in the pool problem. You can't set up sections of the pool and say, no peeing in this section, peeing in that section's fine, and not expect that everyone's going to be exposed to urine at some point, And so think about measles. Measles is very highly transmissible and people move all over the country. If you have a massive measles epidemic somewhere, it then moves somewhere else and everybody is exposed. And keep in mind, sometimes we have this myth that if you get vaccinated, you're going to be fine. Well, maybe vaccines aren't perfect. So if there's a lot of measles out there, people who are vaccinated actually get measles and can suffer the consequences. But also there are kids, there are adults who have immunocompromised conditions. They have cancer. And the whole point of protecting them is that there's not measles out there. Because if there is measles, they could get very, very sick. Same with chickenpox or other infectious diseases that are vaccine preventable. So the consequences are severe regionally in those places where they're basically saying, we're going to take a big step back from public health protections. But there are consequences everywhere. And that's what's really unfortunate here. And there's also message pollution. And we saw this very much during the pandemic, that if you had one governor saying, COVID is way overrated and, the vaccine may not work or whatever, then, those messages move across the border too. And it's really confusing. And one of the axioms of public health communication is you really want people to hear a similar message from every source. And the example that I use in my class on public health crises is, if you're sitting around watching TV and there's a notice that says tornado coming, run to your basement, and you get a message on your phone, tornado coming, run to your basement, and then your mom calls and says, there's a tornado coming. Are you in your basement? Then there's a pretty good chance you're going to stop watching your favorite show and go downstairs. On the other hand, if it says tornado coming on your TV and then you get a text message saying they're lying about tornadoes and your mom calls you and says, tornadoes are mythical things. There are no tornadoes. Don't buy into the whole big weather thing. Then you may not go downstairs. You may just keep watching your show because you want to keep watching your show. And so it is very impactful what they're doing, even if a particular region can minimize the harm.
Actually, I do my own research, and my book here by Big Tornado is telling me.
You do your own research about tornadoes. They're windy. So just to stay on that point, Josh, I think maybe naively or maybe incorrectly, some of us thought, oh, well, there is a consensus about public health and what public health is. And, it's carried forward. And then COVID seems to have broken that, or at least exposed something with some disagreement. And now, like so many aspects of American society, public health has taken on a partisan cast. There's a red view of public health and a blue view of public health. And as you're saying, like, unless these messages are similar from many sources, people, don't hear them, or they don't take them into account. Is there any way to unbreak the statue?
It's a really important question. And a friend of mine wrote a piece a while ago, let's try to keep vaccines from going the way of climate change. And, climate change initially was not partisan. I think President George H.W. Bush talked about climate change. And I think over time, it's become more and more and more partisan. Vaccines are now starting to do that. And that is very, very unfortunate. It is very hard to have public health succeed in such a nasty and partisan environment. Public health is what we do collectively to assure the conditions in which people can be healthy. That's the Institute of Medicine definition. And it's what we do collectively. And when there's no collective, when there's so much anger, when people are, doing all kinds of gotchas and there's so much false information floating around, it's really hard to succeed at a collective project. And that's, I think, fundamentally the risk. Now, at the same time, I don't think that people have turned their backs on public health. If you look at vaccine requirements for school, consistently, it's 3/4 of people are supporting them. There is a lot of support. There is not a huge pro-measles contingent in this country. There are some people that are actually pro-measles, but it is not big. Most people do not want their kids exposed to a life-threatening disease or the risk of a horrible neurologic complication several years later. And what I tell my students is, it's a confusing time, but public health problems require public health solutions. And eventually people are going to have to come together and recognize that we have to find some way through this mess. It's really unfortunate, though. And I hope that we can get to a better place. And I do think, we don't have to go through the whole COVID discussion, but I do think there are things that public health could have done better and differently during the pandemic. I've written about that. But I don't think that the fundamental problem here is, a decision that was made in 2020. I think the fundamental problem is that our society is so fractured that it's really hard for a collective effort to succeed.
Josh, piggybacking on that, do you think, or do you see a global shift in just information hygiene, whether it's in the public health sector or not, but that infects the public health sector? And it is this, that concern about consequences that are not immediately foreseeable has become a kind of elitist idea, a kind of something easily labeled as woke. And therefore, since much of what public health is required to do, which is say, hey, I know you don't see any absolutely immediate consequence to this behavior, but it's going to happen, that the marketplace for that kind of reasoning and argumentation has globally gone down, and therefore it has effects even in new realms where you might try to make a public health statement and have people accept it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's a tough question. This is really inherent to public health. When I'm a pediatrician, physician, but also have worked in public health, and I get so much satisfaction in my positions when health of the whole community improves. When we have fewer overdoses. In Baltimore, we had like a 2/3 reduction in overdoses that our policies played a big part of back maybe 15 years ago. When infant mortality goes down, there are kids walking around Baltimore who would not be alive but for the efforts that the health department put in place. That is incredible satisfaction, but it's not quite the same as saying, I cracked your chest and massaged your heart back to life with my bare hands, which is what some, physicians actually do during the day. And they know those people have a big scar. They know exactly who saved their life. And that has always been a challenge facing public health. And it is particularly hard now. People call me and go, exactly how many people will be dying because of what's going on at CDC and HHS? And it's like, well, kind of depends. You have to make some assumptions here, but we know that people will be dying. We know that these efforts are successful. But it makes for a more difficult conversation. I don't think the whole world is having exactly the US experience right now. And I think that I don't even think the US I think there are plenty of people in this country who are worried about problems. And increasingly, we are going to see the manifestation of problems like measles and other preventable diseases. And it'll be much more tangible for people. It's been hard to say, you guys remember, Hib? It was a horrible bacterial disease. Kids couldn't breathe and they got horrible, meningitis too. And, nobody remembers Hib. Like I started my pediatric training right after the Hib vaccine had really come in. And I never saw a case my entire career. And so, how could I expect a parent to understand why that vaccine is being given? But, increasingly, we're going to see the consequences. And it's our responsibility to find a way to talk about it, to find people who survive those infections, to have courageous people on all sides of the aisle, people in different fields. This is sort of getting a little bit to what I think public health could have done better during the pandemic, is really try to broaden as much as possible the engagement and the involvement of people from different backgrounds and political views in the public health, process. I think we really have to do that. And so there's a lot of work for our field to do. There's a lot of work, though, for everyone to do. This is something that matters for every single family.
Josh Sharfstein, thanks for coming on the Gabfest.
My pleasure.
This episode is brought to you by Saks Fifth Avenue. Saks Fifth Avenue makes it easy to get creative with your personal style and find the best arrivals for fall. I was just floating around on Saks's website, Saks.com, and I found all kinds of cute things, like a cool pair of sunglasses, a beanie cashmere hat by Gorski, socks that looked appealing, a Camilla bucket hat. So this fall, whether you're trying out the latest fashion trends or curating a closet that stands the test of time, Saks has you covered. Saks makes shopping feel personal. They have trusted in-store stylists who are there to guide and inspire you. And if you prefer online shopping, Saks.com offers a curated selection tailored to your taste, from new arrivals by your favorite designers to stylish pieces for your everyday needs. Whether it's date night, a vacation, a special occasion, or just lounging in style, Saks helps you find the perfect look for every occasion. If you want shopping to be fun and easy, then head to Saks Fifth Avenue for inspiring ways to elevate your personal style every day.
This episode is brought to you by Planned Parenthood Federation of America. You've seen the headlines. The Trump administration is attacking sexual and reproductive health care. It's the kind of big, urgent topic that deserves more than just cocktail chatter. But Planned Parenthood Federation of America's commitment to care never stops, no matter what. Planned Parenthood health centers are still here, providing compassionate, affordable, and judgment-free care for everyone. Some lawmakers are trying to end abortion access, slash funding people rely on for care, and shut down Planned Parenthood health centers. These attacks only deepen the healthcare crisis they created, putting millions at risk. But here's the truth. Planned Parenthood has been there for over a century because of supporters like you. With your commitment, they can keep defending the care people need, whether it's birth control, cancer screenings, abortion, gender-affirming care, or sex education. Planned Parenthood believes everyone should have the freedom to make decisions about their own bodies, no matter what, and that's something worth fighting for. When freedoms are at risk, what you do during pivotal moments matters most. Join the fight for health and rights by making a gift to support Planned Parenthood at plannedparenthood.org/defend.
Comcast is committed to bringing access to the internet to all Americans, including rural communities across the country, like Sussex County, Delaware.
We were being left behind. Everybody around us seemed to have internet, but we did not. High-speed internet is one of those good things that we needed to help us move our farming, our small businesses, our recreation forward.
Learn more about how we're bringing our next-generation network to more people across the country at ComcastCorporation.com/investment in America.
Congress is back after a nice, long August recess, one that started early so that Republicans could avoid having to answer too many questions about Epstein or take votes about Epstein files. They've come back with Epstein still on the table, but also there's the much more interesting and more consequential question about funding the government and the prospect of a government shutdown if they don't pass a spending bill by, I think, October 1st. So in order to pass a spending bill, I mean, John will get to the particulars in a second. In order to pass a spending bill, that they need a majority in the House to pass it, and then they need a 60 votes in the Senate. Effectively, the Democrats could filibuster this bill. And so the question is whether, as in March, Senator Schumer will ask the Democrats to hold the line, which he did not do in March, and not allow the Republicans to pass this bill and thus shut the government down, or whether they will go along with the request to sort of continue at current funding levels, the government. I haven't explained that as clearly as possible. John, just where are we with this, and what are the next steps to be taken?
Well, where we are is this is basically we are stuck again in shutdown theater, which we have been for 15 years, basically. The government is funded through October 1st. As you said, there are 12 annual spending bills that are supposed to be taken care of by then. This hasn't happened on regular order for 15 years, as I recall. The normal is that we're in now is constant shutdowns with little snooze bars in between, continuing resolutions that keep the temporary funding going. The new problem this year is that you not only have the question of spending, well, there are a variety of things involved. What you described, David, is exactly right. This is the challenge the Democrats face. Do they have a fight and use the fight to make a larger case about the president and the Republicans? Or if by having their fight, they get blamed for a shutdown. This is part of evaluating who gets blamed for shutdowns. And then secondarily, whether the Democratic Party can get on the right foot of anything because their leaders are weak and confused. The party is having infighting. And therefore, even if they had the right message, could they even get it out? And so they have to make all those decisions. There are also these other things embedded that are a challenge, which is that basically the administration, going back to our topic about executive expansion, is basically saying through the use of what's called a pocket rescission, which I can go on for long about, but I won't at the moment, is basically saying we're not going to spend, and they've done this already since January, but we're not going to spend what was appropriated. And they'll use a loophole in a law that was intended to keep presidents from doing this, the Impoundment Control Act, I should say, and basically not spend money that Congress has appropriated. So within this fight, you have this larger, again, fight about who has the power to decide spending decisions. And that matters a tiny bit because there are some vestiges of people on the Republican side who care about the institutional prerogatives, which are distinct from their partisan affiliation. In the past, when those conflicts have taken place, partisan affiliation wins, and that's likely to again, but it might slow the thing down, and it's a part of the process that we're in here.
I mean, I hear Susan Collins talking about institutional prerogatives and the Impoundment Control Act and the problem of bipartisan negotiations for the budget if after the fact the president is just going to throw all the cards in the air and rip them up, right? Which seems like what we're talking about.
Yeah, you can get a 60-vote deal, and then the president can say, I'm not going to spend this money, and there's expedited consideration inside the Impoundment Control Act, which allows Congress to vote on a 50-vote basis. And so he just doesn't spend the money that was agreed to by 60, and then that decision not to spend the money only needs to be agreed to by 50, and then the money doesn't get spent. There's also this thing, a pocket rescission, which I'll do quickly. There's a 45-day clock when the president says, I'm not going to spend this money, that it goes back to Congress, and Congress can either agree with him or not. If they don't agree with him, the money gets spent. If the president makes that decision with only, let's say, 30 days left in the period where that money can be spent, then it never gets spent because the 45 days happens in a longer time frame than the 30 days that are left in which the money can be spent. So your manager gives you a gift card and says, this is for $100. Congratulations, great job. The CEO doesn't want that money to be spent. So the CEO says, okay, but you can't spend the gift card until October 1st. The problem is the gift card runs out and is valid until only September 30th. So it's a way to use the Impoundment Control Act to not spend money.
And this is the Trump administration's plan for about $6 billion of foreign aid that it hasn't already canceled in other ways.
But actually, can I just identify a third thing, which is not quite so technical or is not quite so legal, which is that there was all this money allocated, like money designated to be spent on the Department of Education or other things, where the Trump administration was just like, we're not going to carry out the duties of the department anymore. We're not going to do the things. We're not going to who do these things. Yeah, we're just not. You have funded these things them to do this, but they're not going to do it. So even if the money is theoretically there to be spent, if the administration refuses to actually do the thing that the law says it's supposed to do, then it also makes the the funding bill slightly meaningless. So given all of that, Emily, what possible incentive is there for Democrats to compromise on some sort of continuing resolution spending bill? What incentive is there for Chuck Schumer to get half a dozen Democrats to agree to vote for this bill and get it passed?
I mean, politics, if the Democrats conclude that defying or standing up to the Trump administration would be worse for them. And I guess my question to John is, I mean, the Democrats have been in like serious disarray and pretty bad in general at responding and figuring out where to take Trump on and where they can really like find a hill to die on, where everyone's going to understand and it will make their approval ratings go up and Trump approval ratings go down and factor into the midterms. So is this it? Like, can they get it together to explain everything that we just tried to briefly explain in a way that will get the American people behind them when they threaten to shut the government down, which people generally don't like very much?
Yes.
Right.
So I guess I have no idea what the actual answer to that is, but here are some things to think about in that. The first of all is the timing right? Are we close enough to the voting that will take place in 2026 that any opinion anybody draws today won't be changed by events between now and then? In other words, that votes can be changed or that the history can be grooved deep enough in the memory that you can then recall it when people go to the voting booth. So that's the first question, is whether. Second question is whether national messages even exist anymore, and that whether you can swamp in the number of races where control of the House will matter, you can swamp the individual efforts in those races to control the opinions of the voters. I mean, there's a perfectly reasonable argument to be made on the other side, which is that national politics controls everything. We just don't know yet where we'll be at that time. But adjacent to that fact is that there aren't that many, at least at the moment, districts in play that are really jump balls, where you can sway enough voters to matter about the strength of that district. Depending on how you count, it's from like 15 to 20, 25. Now, you don't need many victories in those for Democrats to take control of the House, but it shrinks the field. The other question is, what's the issue? If it's just on shutdown government grounds, because we've been doing this for 15 years or so, I think it's hard to kind of hang the difficulties of things on a party in a way that's effective. Everybody's ratings are low, and Democrats are still pretty low in the public consciousness. However, and now I'm coming to the conclusion here, I think embedded in this fight should be a debate or discussion over the Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies that were made available as a part of the American Rescue Plan and then extended in the Inflation Reduction Act. If these go away, the people, many of whom live in red districts, who receive subsidies to pay for their health care will lose those subsidies. And we're talking about major changes to their insurance premiums will go up significantly. And that is a potentially huge issue for those people. They will essentially lose coverage because they won't be able to pay for it. The question is, the people who will be most hurt are at the lower end of the income scale. And so the question is, can you mobilize them and that kind of thing? But if you could imagine, and maybe this is sort of totally fiction, but you could imagine a party of the past where a key issue that has a human face like this could be used to be the centerpiece of such a fight. All those other questions I raised notwithstanding. But who makes that fight? Who makes that argument? It seems to me you'd have to find an issue like that, which is human, which goes to affordability, which is what people care about. And I'm not sure if that's the issue, but they should find one. The general issue of a shutdown doesn't seem to me to be salient enough.
So let's go to cocktail chatter. When you, Emily Bazelon, are in your own weekend shutdown, what are you going to be chattering about?
I am so sad that the summer is beginning to come to an end. I say beginning because, of course, it is not officially over until later in September, but I am going to miss peaches and amazing little sun gold tomatoes. And I had the privilege and great pleasure this summer of going to 2 second weddings that were both like beautiful and wonderful.
You mean they were really short?
No, I mean they were the second marriage.
I do.
All the people involved. And in reflecting on them, here's what I there were two things I treasured about them the most. So first of all, like they both had like very deep feelings that got expressed in a kind of semi-public way, which I feel like is very unusual for people generally, but also like older people. And part of a second wedding is that you're like more of a full-on grown-up. And so you get to design your own, I don't know, I didn't have as much like design and control over my own wedding in my mid-20s as I felt like all of these people did. And there was something so lovely about that and so really like profound in the emotions expressed. It made me realize that I just don't like have moments that often where I feel like everyone's heart is like on display, and I had my own strong feelings that I was like really glad to have. I was like entirely in the moment. And the second thing is, and this is so obvious, but I'll say it anyway, dancing when there are like small children and people in their 20s and middle-aged people and old people all on the same dance floor is like my favorite thing. And I got to do that at both of these events. So ode to the second wedding.
Are you thinking of having a second wedding yourself? What does Mr. Bazelon say about that?
It was funny. At the end of this ceremony for the one I went to last weekend, someone said to me like, oh my God, now I really want to go renew my vows with my husband. And I looked at my husband, who was really not interested in doing that whatsoever, and thought, I don't think that is really going to happen. And I think I'll keep him. But I'm glad other people are getting married.
Having celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary yesterday,
mazel tov.
I have always felt that the public standing up around and curating your friends and like just a moment to make a declaration of the kinds of feelings you're talking about, Emily, in public is a reason to have these ceremonies. In other words, why get married is a constant question. And I think there is something in the act that really forces those kinds of questions. And you're right. It would be great if everybody, when they first do it, get it, but you just haven't lived the life enough yet to know about some of those things that you might know about by the time you go to a second wedding, including what probably happened in the first one. 1.2 million immigrants are gone from the U.S. labor force, according to Pew. And I was interested in that because immigrants make up almost 20% of the U.S. workforce. So those are both documented and undocumented. And I mean, this is still playing out in the labor force, and particularly in as we've talked about, in construction, in agriculture and farming, fishing, forestries, like. The ripples are coming, and one way to see, or one interesting part of our economic picture we're in right now is there's been so much talk of inflation, and there will continue to be as long as tariffs are a part of the taxation scheme that is used to bring in revenue for the Treasury. But jobs are going to be a big conversation. We're about to get a jobs number on Friday, but already the preliminary report from one group says that the economy added just 54,000 jobs in August, and the weakening of the labor market is a problem. And if you have that at the same time, you're losing all of these people who do labor in these other key industries. That suggests a double problem. So, more potential problems on the horizon, ladies and gentlemen.
My chatter, just a pair of half-baked chatters. One, I mean, I was surprised to wake up this morning and discover I had not won the lottery. I'm just an inveterate player of the big lotteries, and
you are? How did I not know this about you?
Yeah,
Maybe you hide that fact because it's embarrassing.
It's not embarrassing. The idea of it sparks the imagination, the possibility of winning just gigantic sums of money for no particular reason. It is not. I'm not interested in gambling per se, because I know that gambling is a loser's bet, as is a lottery ticket is a loser's bet. But on the off chance you win, it truly is a magnificently huge amount of money that you could win. And it allows you to sort of sit and imagine a different kind of world where you own a compound in Montana.
Does any of that stick, that thinking that goes on, or is it pure reverie?
Oh, what do you mean? Does it stick?
Well, there are all these posters and Instagram stories about what would you do if, money wasn't an issue. And then you're supposed to go do all those things because you're being held back by the mere constraints of reality.
I think a little of it does stick, but I definitely spend a lot of time. My girlfriend and I spend a lot of time talking about it, and I know it's embarrassing, but it's also it's nice to think about. The trip to the World Cup that I would be taking when I win $1.7 billion on Saturday. Anyway, that's one chatter. Emily and John, just like the look on their faces, they're so disappointed.
No,
I've never said anything so disappointing.
No,
to Emily,
I don't find it disappointing in the least. I totally get it.
I do.
So it's all as well.
The other thing I want to chatter about is a wonderful new kids book. If you need a kids book, you all know what of course I used to be at Atlas Obscura, and Atlas Obscura is a new book. The Atlas Obscura Explorer's Guide to Inventing the World. It's a book by my old friend and colleague Dylan Thuris and Jennifer Swanson, and it's just a beautifully illustrated, magnificently illustrated kids book about all these inventions and where they come from and places you can kind of see them in action. So I'm looking at the largest map of space ever made, but also the original Babylonian map of the world. I'm looking at the Antikythera shipwreck, which they've discovered this incredible mechanism, this mechanism that was in this Greek shipwreck. It's just a great book for kids, so check it out. The Atlas Obscura Explorer's Guide to Inventing the World. Listeners, please keep your chatters coming. Please email them to us at gabfest@slate.com. It's so great to get them. And this week's listener chatter comes from somebody who has just the most perfect combination of name and location. John Haggard in Alabaster, Alabama. Alabaster, Alabama. What a place. I have to look it up on the map.
Hey, Gabfest. This is John Haggard from Alabaster, Alabama. For my cocktail chatter this week, I wanted to highlight an excellent piece of reporting in my local paper, the Shelby County Reporter, called Cost of Simplicity, State SSUT Structure Affects Local Cities by Noah Wortham. Not many reporters at any organization jump at the chance to investigate complicated tax policy changes and how they impact citizens, let alone reporters at small local papers with limited resources. Noah decided to delve into how the state of Alabama made changes to its tax code to cater to large online retailers like Amazon and DoorDash, and how these changes are robbing local communities of tax revenue, and more importantly, how a single line tucked deep into the bill diverted state tax money away from education. The prevailing sentiment is that local community newspapers are creeping closer to extinction every day, but thanks to dogged young reporters like Noah, they aren't accepting this fate quietly.
That is all for our episode this week. We also have a bonus episode in your feed. It's going to be kind of crazy because John and I were just having a sort of side chat before we got started. And we decided that this side chat was going to become our Slate Plus topic. We're going to talk about the Voyager spacecraft, which is now a huge distance from Earth, and what it symbolizes about humanity and the efforts of humanity to traverse space. Because John seems to think it means one thing, and I think it means something else. But that is only for Slate Plus members. So if you are a Slate Plus member, awesome. Good job. Thank you so much. You never hit the paywall on the Slate site. You get discounts to our live shows. We've got live shows coming up. We're going to have live shows aplenty coming up. But if you're not a member, subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or go to slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That's all for our show today. The Gabfest is produced by Kevin Bendis. Our researcher is Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I am David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
This episode is brought to you by Saks Fifth Avenue. Saks Fifth Avenue makes it easy to get creative with your personal style and find the best arrivals for fall. I was just floating around on Saks's website, Saks.com, and I found all kinds of cute things, like a cool pair of sunglasses, a beanie cashmere hat by Gorski, socks that looked appealing, a Camilla bucket hat, So this fall, whether you're trying out the latest fashion trends or curating a closet that stands the test of time, Saks has you covered. Saks makes shopping feel personal. They have trusted in-store stylists who are there to guide and inspire you. And if you prefer online shopping, Saks.com offers a curated selection tailored to your taste, from new arrivals by your favorite designers to stylish pieces for your everyday needs. Whether it's date night, a vacation, a special occasion, or just lounging in style, Saks helps you find the perfect look for every occasion. If you want shopping to be fun and easy, then head to Saks Fifth Avenue for inspiring ways to elevate your personal style every day.